with that, we'll move along to kick off the day with a keynote. I'd like to invite Dale and Elyse to join on the stage. So it's a great pleasure and an honor to be joined up here by Dale Dougherty and Elyse Eidman-Aadahl, who I think are like the two perfect people to be talking about the topic that we have this morning, which we called making, writing, coding. And I think this follows up on some of the themes that we talked about yesterday. Yesterday that we've been talking about the fact that coding, we don't see it just as a technical skill or just some particular new skills you get for getting a job, but really it's a way of pathway towards new ways of thinking, new forms of expression, a new way to communicate in the world. And I think as we try to think about how we can support coding as a new form of expression, new way of communicating in the world, it's great to look to other people who've been looking at those same type of questions, but in different media. And I see lots of links to the work that's being done, both in sort of one of the I was going to say one of the oldest forms of communication with writing, which has been around for 5,000 years or longer. And Elyse is the executive director of the National Writing Project and thinks a lot about questions about engaging people in expression through writing. I hesitated there when I said one of the oldest forms of expression because I realized although writing's been around for 5,000 years, making's been around even longer. So I think people have been making things since, I guess somewhere when humans started to walk around to use their hands, people have been making things. Although there's been a new surge of interest in making and thinking about making as a way of expressing and the learning opportunities that can come through making. And Dale, through his position as CEO of Maker Media, which publishes Make Magazine and produces the Maker Fairs, has really been at the forefront of supporting this new movement, the Maker movement, that really that is looking at how people can engage with the world in new ways through making. And again, another thing that I think connects it together is that even though writing and making have been around for a long time, new technologies always get us to rethink what it means to write and what it means to make and the ways that we engage through writing and making. So I think we want to get together because we felt we all have a lot to learn from one another about what are the ways that we can support these new ways of expression, whether it's through coding or making or through writing. But maybe just to get started, it would be good to hear a little bit more just about the types of areas that Elyse and Dale are working on, because I'm sure some of you are familiar with Make Magazine, Maker Fairs, National Writing Project, but not all of you are. It would be great just to hear a little bit about some of the work that they're doing, and just for a couple minutes, work they're doing and some of the goals of it, and then we'll dive in more deeply. So actually, Dale, do you want to get started saying just a few words about Make Magazine and the Maker movement?
Well, let's see.
Yeah,
there we go. So Make Magazine is 10 years old, and Maker Fairs are about 9 years old. We started really, I was kind of inspired by old popular mechanics, popular science of the 50s, and how those magazines encouraged you to do lots of different things. And I felt it resonated with the hackers that, MIT and other people were trying to make things, whether it's programs and largely software, do something they wanted it to do. And that sense of direction and control and playfulness, I thought, well, it would be fun to kind of create a magazine full of projects, things to do, and show what other people are doing. And then Maker Faire came back because I thought I was meeting such interesting people that I thought many people would enjoy meeting them. But it's really fun it's the old-fashioned show and tell to talk about something you make. And it's actually easy, even for shy, geeky people, to talk about things that they've made. And so that was the impetus for Maker Faire. And I think that what happened over the years, we began to see a flood of kids at Maker Faire. And I say all of this gets younger every year, the interest. seems to get, I kind of imagine, once you think it's high school or teenagers, you see maker spaces in kindergartens, and they were the original makerspace, in so anyways, Montessori and all those. So, apropos of lifelong kindergarten, we seem to drop things that we once valued and we know are effective at engaging kids. So that has drawn me into thinking largely about education and how to get making, which really, to be honest, has been on the margins of our culture, back into the mainstream and back into something not just in education, but in cities and in our lives. So that's sort of my goal. But I think I care mostly about education. We set up a nonprofit Maker Education Initiative, which has a program called Maker Core to work with college-age students as mentors and put them out in like science centers and community centers around the country. But a lot of what we'll talk about here is the sort of the practice of engaging kids in making and doing and creating.
And maybe turning over to a little bit about the National Writing Project and the idea about supporting writing as another form of communication and expression.
So I'm at the National Writing Project, and the National Writing Project is about 40 years old now. Started at the University of California, Berkeley, with one group of teachers, K through university, and a couple of people outside of schools, one summer coming together in a peer learning model to try and work together as practitioners to think about what they would do as educators to support young people becoming better writers. And I'll say a little bit in a second about what I mean by that. But it turned out to be quite a transformative summer. 1974 at UC Berkeley was probably a transformative summer, whether you were in the writing project or not. So of its time, though, that summer became very powerful for those educators, and through their initiative, really, a local writing project site was built at UC Berkeley to continue, and then also through their initiative spread. So now we're a network of about 200 local writing project sites. They're all hosted at universities across the country and a couple abroad. And those are all practitioner collaboratives where people work together in a kind of continuous action research way to learn how to better their teaching or their mentoring. Most people probably in formal education settings, some in museums and libraries, increasingly folks in the out of school. And I would say that the things that unite all of those local writing project sites, one is this vision that practice, engaging powerfully in practice, is in its way a generation of knowledge. So practitioners actually, through practice, inquiry around practice, generate and create knowledge about teaching and learning that actually needs to be surfaced and needs to be shared and needs to be brought into the conversation with all the other places where knowledge comes from about practice. That unites them. Another thing that unites them is that by actually working together across the typical borders and boundaries like secondary, elementary, middle, or formal, informal, or K-12 higher ed, all of those boundaries are things that keep us actually from generating more powerful knowledge about teaching and learning, and so we need to learn as practitioners to work across those and create knowledge together. And then I would add people who work as developers and work with young people in other ways as well, families. So constantly sort of working across borders. And then the other thing is that for us, writing is at the center, but I want to put just one little gloss on what we mean by that. We mean a pretty broad concept of writing. And most of us have probably had schooling that has narrowed a concept of what writing is instead of broadening it. So for us, it's all the meaning-creating activities that humans do when they create meaning and share it with others. So writing happens in text, it happens in media, it happens in image, audio. It happens, for example, when you code a digital story in Scratch. So for those reasons, actually, all those different ways we make and share meaning, the three of us have been having all kinds of conversations about producing, creating, and making with different tools, as tech has enabled us to use different tools for a long time. Yeah. And we're really excited to be here together because even though, for example, we live pretty close to each other, we have to fly somewhere else to see each other. So we're excited to be able to talk about this common theme.
Yeah.
So, yeah, and I do think that is one thing that really unites us, is this idea about creating meaning through the things people create. And I think we're all inspired by this idea of the importance of creating things, making things, producing things. But oftentimes in the world, that has taken a back seat. I know like in the world of literacy, your focus is on writing, but if you go into school, there's a lot more attention paid to reading. Again, and we're all in favor of reading. I promised Elyse ahead of time that we would not come with the headline that Elyse is against reading. She's very much in favor of reading. I want to be clear about that.
All writers want readers, so actually they go together.
Well, on the other hand, but I think we all say that, but in the world, as valuable as reading is, the attention shouldn't be only on reading. And I think we see some parallels in the coding and the making world that in some ways, learning how to just to use an application or to interact with the computer is sort of like reading, and it's valuable. It's useful to be able to just interact and to look things up online is a useful thing to do as reading, but not enough attention goes to the writing. Maybe you can say in the literacy world, that playoff between reading and writing and why more attention on reading and what things you do to try to get more attention to the production of meaning side of things.
So absolutely, let the first headline be that Elyse is in favor of reading, absolutely. But it is an interesting thing. In policy, you certainly see it in assessment, you see it in many, many formal structures, that literacy equals reading. In fact, I'm often in policy settings, or for example, in DC, et cetera, where I have to say to people, literacy and writing. They'll say literacy, oh yeah, literacy and writing. And I'll say, actually, literacy is really both. It's reading and writing. People write stuff so that people can read it, and they read what other people have written. They really go together. I get it. It's literacy and writing. So literacy is really about reading. And if you think of NCLB and other kinds of policy things, all the emphasis is on reading. But actually, we've spent thousands of years, I would say, creating learning institutions that create and hold content, put content in manageable forms, written or other kinds of image. And then in order to have people able to access that prior knowledge, they need to learn how to read. That makes complete sense. So if you think of the start of formal schooling, much of that was about learning to read. Read your Bible, learn to read and access the stuff in the library, learn to read and access the stuff that's delivered to you via the internet on the computer. But actually, nobody really wants people to only consume. That would be like saying the other two language things, speaking and listening. We really want people to be really good listeners, we do, but we don't want them to spend a whole life only listening. What would that be? We want people to produce and participate, and so that's the active side, the production, not the consumption side. So I often like to think and kind of play a game when people would say, oh yeah, writing's important because actually when you write, it helps you learn how to read better. People will say that. That's actually true. There's research that suggests it. And then I'll say, well, so what if we thought about what people will produce, how they'll be knowledge makers, creators, and they'll be writers? How would we teach reading if our end goal was that people became strong, powerful, authoritative, engaged, participatory writers? If that was our goal, and then we saw reading, actually the ability to access the knowledge of others as something that you do on the way to what you produce, would we think about both of them differently? And I think actually probably there's both on the coding and the making side, this notion that if your real emphasis is not on the consumption side, but on what somebody will produce themselves or with their peers, would we shift a million things in teaching different? Would it be different in teaching and learning if our emphasis was on what you're going to do later, what you're going to do now, not even later, but now, what you're doing today, a maker, a doer, a creator, a writer. I think that shifts everything.
And it does seem to be, certainly by its name, the Maker Movement and Make Magazine, it highlights that it's about the production side of things. So there's not much confusion there. But for me, one of the things that's been so important about the Maker Movement is that it's not just about making. Because as much as I think one thing that unites us is that we all believe that there's so much to be gained by engaging people in designing, creating, making, expressing. But we also know that if all you do is sort of follow the instructions to make something, that's not going to live up. So I know that's something you've thought a lot about in your work in the maker movement.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's just interesting too with this, there's sort of this, if you think of reading and writing, there's kind of using technology and there's making technology in this similar way of the force in technology is to make everything easy to use, and it's kind of from a consumer side so we can buy it. From the making side, there's almost, it's always going to be harder. It's gotten easier to do a number of things, but it's always going to be harder. And yet, I think some of the meaning that comes from it is because you have to learn how to do this, and that means something to you. So if it was just simple, it really wouldn't have the value that it does. The challenge that's in making is part of it.
Yeah. But I do think that's something that comes up a lot in our discussions here, because I sometimes get caught with, I want to emphasize, like when we work on Scratch, I'd like to say it's an easy to use approach to programming. Right. And some people in our group, Natalie, they're always sort of looks at me and says, we shouldn't be focused just the easy to use. Yeah. Of course, we don't want things to be needlessly hard. But it's more that it's engaging and meaningful and motivating, not just that it's easy.
Well, one of the things along the meaning, and I've just been kind of realizing this about Maker Faire, is that something that if you've been to how many people have been to a Maker Faire? Okay, good, a good number, but there's some people we have to work on. One of the things that you might surprise you if you haven't been there is how many different kinds of things are there. That this doesn't belong next to the other thing. And I'm really proud of that it's sort of jarring in that way. And I kind of think about, well, what brings this together? And a lot of it, I've been thinking, is people sort of create these things actually to interact with people. It's like they're using technology and they're using other things. It could be, knitting, sewing, electronics, robots, but they're actually putting it out to create that interaction with someone else, which could be like a game and it could be just a conversation. But and many of the things that we build, I think, have those properties, or we write to communicate, and we don't write just to put it away in a diary. We want to communicate and connect to other people. So it's a very human thing. And I brought a few examples, just little things that made me think of these are kind of the Scratch programs of the making world, the little things that you could figure. And I found this, this is this little jar, and I'll show you in a minute, but found it in Hanover, and Maker Faire in Hanover, Germany, and a fellow from the Netherlands had created, and he was leading little workshops in it. So it's a tilt sensor inside it. And so like a firefly in a bottle, if you turn it up, it goes on, and if you flip it, it goes off. And inside is just it's all soldered, but that's the tilt sensor, an LED battery, and it's hot glued to the bottom. And I know you can't all see it from the back, but it's 3 or 4 components. And yet this, as a kid, you could do this almost all day long doing this, right? Right. We have this one kind of classic project, and I actually think it might have come from someone at MIT, and I didn't know that at the time we did it. It's called the Useless Machine. And, and we actually, Colbert had it on his report. And it does the simplest thing. You turn it on, it turns itself off.
Right.
That's all it does. But, and this is just one other little one, and this is like a learn to solder project. In the back there's 2 little batteries, but if you turn it on, the lights are on, and it's just RGB values, but you can control the color of the light. And in many ways these are the very simplest kinds of projects, but blinky lights are kind of the gateway drug of making. Wow, it lit up, and then the next step is I can control it. But think about what that means. That sense of doing something. I mean, yes, you could control the TV, you can control the screens here, but this is something where you've controlled that interaction, and you're the one driving it. The other thing I'll mention about this was this whole board as a kit was designed by an 8th grader, Quinn Etnier, and just a quick story about him. This last spring, he went before a school board, and he said, I'm trying to figure out which high school to go to, and I don't see any of your high schools supporting the kinds of things I want to do. And the superintendent asked him, well, where'd you learn to do all this? And he had explained that he'd been he went to a Maker Faire, he got Make Magazine, he started exhibiting at Maker Faire, he went to Maker Faire Rome last year. He said, I met the mayor and the Pope, and had all these, and he has a website where he makes these things and sells them. And he works on his kitchen table to make kits, and he sends them out. And the superintendent asked him, where'd you learn this? And he said, well, outside of school. And the superintendent didn't really like that answer. And so he called me up and he said, well, how do we get this, because actually Quinn was advocating for others. He says, I might be able to do this outside of school, but I know a lot of my classmates can't. And so how do we bring this into school and do these kind of projects?
That's great. And actually, as you were sharing that, I was thinking, I saw that Colbert episode, and you saw people entranced on television for like 2 minutes, like an eternity in TV time, just watching this machine go. And there is such a moment of joyfulness in this, and I think that's something that's also really important. It's less actually a singular vision that either writing or making or coding in and of itself is the thing. It's the way that I think in a particular moment and movement of writing process work, in the current maker movement, in what you all are creating in Scratch, it's how something surrounds that thing, and that thing enables people to create a different model of joyful and engaged learning. Maybe it's a particular moment, something we could talk about, whether there's a moment in the arc of something and it's spread where people can bring a kind of passion, the 4 Ps, passion and play, with peers to something, to a project, to an effort. But that's really, in a way, what is the key. We have a way of, I think, confusing solemnity and seriousness. The notion that if you're serious about something, I'm serious about learning, I must be solemn about it. I must be very solemn about what the things are, as opposed to the notion that of serious play, for example. And I think that's also something, the atmosphere. And I'm just thinking of a conversation that I had with someone in a school of engineering who was actually looking at a kind of makerspace, a U-Media learning lab in a library makerspace, and lamenting, as someone who's a professor of engineering, that what he was seeing was the beginnings of engineering, and wondering why it was that engineering schools killed it. And one of the things that he said was, here people are actually making things. I don't think, this is engineering. He says, no. Engineering schools are not about making things. It's about preparing later to make really serious things. And I had never gone to a school of engineering, so I was sort of fascinated to listen to him talk about how no one actually makes much in an engineering school. They only prepare. So this notion of actually a deferred engagement, a deferred participation, and let's fill you up with everything you need now to do something really serious later, actually can affect, I think, all of these tools and all of these movements.
I think that's true. Some of the spaces I particularly see at universities, one of the phrases I kind of hear, I heard this down at SMU in Dallas, but specifically a design professor said we needed to create a space where students could choose to fail and not have constant. They wouldn't do that in the formal programs because they're getting graded. And I think that we see that a lot. We want kind of this, and I think the competitive nature of a lot of our activities takes it away from being play. We have an expression around Maker Faire that we use that I think is pretty nice, exhibition, not competition, and really the showing of work, rather than saying, well, this is against this or this is better than this. There's a lot of ways to connect with this stuff, and I think, again, like a library of Scratch programs, you can look at, and while I think you can have challenges and give people motivation to do something, I think that's cool. But really what we're looking for is to increase the body of work and visibility into the body of work, not just find a few good things.
Right. That's the way, like in the Scratch community, we have the Scratch Design Studio. So it's more a place where you exhibit some works, as opposed to having a weekly contest to show the best project. And it's not about that. But there is some value to sort of rallying people together around some themes, and certainly see this in the maker movement. You want to sort of have ways that people can come together and have some structure that they're participating in, but something where everyone still is able to develop their own voice.
Right.
We talk about engineering with some of the things that we do in various robotics competitions. There's making involved there, but I sometimes worry when it gets focused just on who's going to do the best and who's going to sort of plan it out, execute it, and deliver, as opposed to focusing on the creative process and the different diversity of things that might come out of that process.
Yeah, I'm concerned about that too. And I think, again, in an ecosystem where there's some balance in it, it's a good thing. Yep. But if there is a sense sometimes we copy these things and everything has to be a competition and it has to have high stakes to it. And the costs are high in doing them. And I think that just sort of isn't such a good thing.
There's probably things that we can learn, I think right now there's over the last decade with the maker movement, people are going increasingly interested in making and opportunities that moves into formal education. And similarly now with coding in the last couple of years, a lot of interest and a lot of visibility around it. But I think we also can see how there's a risk of it getting narrowed down in ways that we've seen with writing as well. Writing's been in schools for a long time, but not always in the ways that you would want. It might be interesting to talk about some of the lessons learned from some of the ways we see writing being brought into schools. And I do think there's some parallels with I think you had mentioned before, focusing on the syntax, the vocabulary, as opposed to the expression.
Right. I just reminded. So I was once at the Department of Ed, in D.C., and I just came out of an elevator. Someone recognized me, and just without even a conversation, said, "Tell me, is there some project that every seventh grader in America can do?" And it was sort of like that checkbox mentality of well, then we've got them making. And similarly, Hour of Code or something that we've got them coding, and it's really a much more deliberate, long-term process that we're talking about here. And I think it involves a community of people that influence it and shape it. It's I think one of the things that interests me about Maker Faire is that it's become a cultural thing, and it's about a cultural change, not just sort of here's a technology or here's a practice. It's really how do we think about it and its influence on us and where do we see it going. And it's really hard to do, and I feel lucky that it's somewhat sparked this. I don't know if we had a White House Maker Faire in June, and I have to say it was kind of makers are a bit of a band of misfits, like we didn't fit in here, and then to be celebrated at the White House, is a little bit like stand awestruck.
Was a little suspicious to have the makers showing.
But on the other hand, it really sort of raised the level, and you kind of realize this is, it's sort of reached this visibility that is kind of. I hope.
Beware of legitimacy.
Exactly. Exactly. Becoming mainstream isn't always the best thing, but on the other hand, you want to drive this to everybody, and you want people to see it. And I think one of the big drivers for the maker movement, I think, is families today. It's just a lot of this is. Almost a reaction to some of the iPad apps and things where, they're kind of isolating, and making can be a very social activity. It's go out and build a rocket and shoot it off in the park. You could have done that 50 years ago. It was fun then, it was fun today. And I think people see that this, in a broader sense of learning, is just a satisfying activity, and they want to kind of do it together.
Yeah, writing has a special problem, and I'll name it so that we can see whether that's something that should be of caution to any of our colleagues. The special problem writing has is that it's a primary mode of transaction for assessment. So actually, in a way that is for people who write, is very counter. If you think of people who write in the wild, people who are writing for their own purposes, not as part of a school assignment. Typically, you are writing about something where you have become an authority. You know something that your reader doesn't. And it could be as simple as, I know what the grocery list is, and you don't, and I'm going to leave it on the refrigerator. So it doesn't have to be, capital K knowledge. But typically you write something for someone who needs to read it from you because you know something about it and they don't, and that's a writer-reader transaction. Writing in assessment, writing in testing, the essay test or the short answer test, is exactly the opposite of that. You're generally writing to an assessor who knows more about the topic than you do. So actually the construction of that reader-writer relationship is, I won't use the word, but backwards is part of the phrase. And so if in fact almost all of your writing experiences are writing as testing, you being tested by a judgmental reader, what kind of model does that set to you about what writing is? And how hard is it to grow beyond that and out of that? It's why people will say often when they have a very powerful writing experience, that I discovered I really am a writer.
Yeah.
And of course they've been writing in some form for years and years and years, but that being a writer is a very significant mental shift. I think being a maker, also seeing, because you could say similarly, well, you've made and created things your whole life. No, now I see myself as a maker. So there's some identity shift that's really powerful in all of these that are significant. So one thing I would say, for us, and I think it's true at Maker Faire, and I think it's true in the Scratch community, there's something about going through that yourself. For us, we always, in summer institutes and other sorts of places where people come together in the writing project, they do a lot of things. They demonstrate practices to each other, they read together, they do research together, but we always write. We experience what it's like to be a writer, we have response group, whatever it is we're working on. You have to do the thing too, so that you can experience that inside. And when you do experience that, I think a lot changes. The environment changes. For example, you realize how you used peers or mentors or models. You realized how the design of space enabled or constrained you from finding the help you needed or the resources that you needed. You understood differently how you could apprentice yourself to someone who knew something that you wanted to learn. So doing it yourself and going through that identity shift, I think, is really, really critical. And for so many of us, I think this happens, for example, in things like the Hour of Code, et cetera, which in the writing project, we proudly also helped people find out about the Hour of Code. In many cases, we're creating learning situations where people haven't been able to connect that identity shift to it. And you may need to be, you may need the gateway activities, you may need to play with stuff a while in order to go through the identity shift. But I think one of the things that happens is we often emphasize in all our communities, or we share, let's say the gateway activities, but we don't have a sustained overall engagement with an environment, with peers that we can really learn from and apprentice ourselves to go through that identity shift. Because no one goes through that identity shift with a 1-hour activity or a single engagement with making a digital story in Scratch. You do that over time by being around other people who think and express differently because they have gone through that. And then you sort of say, wow, that's a way to be. I'd like to be one of those.
I think that's really profound. I think that sort of captures a lot of things here. I mean, and since you started with assessment, and you're almost saying like the real validation comes from a community, right? And we actually don't get that through our school assessments. You actually get very little meaningful feedback from participating in those things. And I want to say, like, as much as reading, almost on the making side, math is this interesting parallel where math is used to assess you, right? And so, you know, a lot of folks want, well, if you're good at making, will you do better in math? And you almost don't want to create that, causality or connection there. Even though it's kind of interesting, a lot of school maker spaces that we've worked with were organized by math teachers, and on reflecting, I kind of thought, well, one of the reasons was more that they worked with kids who struggle more than anything, and they're trying to reach those students in new ways. And it wasn't that they were particularly gifted at making themselves, but they said, I've got remedial math learners who are taking 2 years to do a year program. If I could take some of that time and devote it to things that really engage and motivate them, maybe I can make them, better math learners. But, again, it doesn't necessarily make them better testers, but see how they're using math and express, and thinking rather than just.
It's also
testing.
often a reflection of the way math is taught in school.
Exactly.
That for certain kids succeed with it, but the kids who are seen as not good at math, they're not good at the way schools currently teach math.
Right.
But they might be good at the math that's embedded in maker activities.
But it also it's almost an attitude. There's one kid who's kind of like a bad kid in this math class that I heard say, you already know the answer to that problem.
Yeah.
Like, why are you asking me?
Yeah.
And I think that idea of experimental play and things is kids really want to deal with things where we don't know the answer yet. We don't know the outcomes. Yeah. And a lot of school is giving them sort of predictable things. Yeah. And I always say, like, chemistry used to be a really interesting subject, but the way we teach it even in the labs is follow all these steps and we all get the same result and check the box and go home. And that's not really
Which is
exploratory.
counter to what science is.
Yes,
the
absolutely.
same way that.
But that's the trouble is we say it's STEM and we kind of teach it not as a way of thinking, but as a body of knowledge and not as a way of experiencing the world, interacting with the world, given better tools to interact with the world. Yeah. One of the most depressing things, I looked on California STAR testing, and I was looking through their tests online. They had sample questions, and one page I came across was if I showed it to you, you'd think it was a textbook because it was explaining what a microscope was. It had all the call-outs of the pieces, components of a microscope. It described in kind of sort of highfalutin language what it was. But it never really conveyed the idea that it was a new way of seeing things that you can't see. And it asked a question that had to do, like, if you adjusted the knob the wrong way, it broke the glass. Yeah. And, like, why would you ask that question, right? Instead of what do you see with a microscope and what kind of worlds you're exploring with a microscope. That's science, not this sort of catch, we can catch you on something and get a good question.
Well, this somewhat opens up to the question of what is it that we hope people are going to learn through the activities we're involved in? Because I think that another thing is that too often in the worlds that we travel in, people are focused on learning specific concepts. And again, there's nothing wrong with learning specific concepts, but I don't think that's what drives us as you try to drive people to do maker activities. It's not about learning specific concepts. It's about different practices, ways, strategies of designing, creating, thinking. Similarly with coding, it's less about just learning about variables or conditionals. It's more about ways of strategies for designing, creating, debugging. And I assume similarly in writing. But maybe it's more about what are the things that you're hoping people will gain?
Well, I think one of the things that I think is very powerful about making is that it's personal, and I feel like it wants to start here inside of you. And the DIY idea that we talked about isn't necessarily that you do everything yourself, but you have to initiate that, expression of an interest, having a choice of what to do. Because I really think what you're trying to do is create self-directed learning out of this and self-directed learners. So people, and that's, I think, the quality that I see in, say, innovators and creators that ties them together. And yet we don't necessarily encourage that properly in school. Sometimes we take control away from kids, or we tell them what to do instead of allowing them to initiate action. And so I think really, and you might think that when I'm thinking about making, I'm thinking about hands-on learning. And yes, there is that quality in introducing that, but it's more about the learning that I'm interested in and seeing yourself as a competent, capable learner. And I think one of the sort of fundamental pieces of making is it gives you lots of feedback. This light goes on or it doesn't, right? And you wonder why it doesn't, and you try to fix it. And it's not a test that goes off and you get back 3 weeks later. It's something that gives you constant feedback as a process, and I think it makes you a better learner, and it engages you so that you are learning. But this is more about setting up experiences that accumulate in meaning and value to you than it is, do you know this concept? I believe they will encounter those concepts, and there's a place to introduce and talk about them. In many ways, I think the perfect activity in making is something that you build, that you get to play with. And the play, like a race car or a robot, you look at the performance of that thing and you begin to say, how does it change to be better or different or faster, slower? And that starts to introduce you into some of the conceptual frameworks. but it grounds you in engaging and relevant experiences.
I was even building on your microscope analogy, the same way that they missed the point that the microscope is a new way of seeing the world. Making is a new way of seeing the world, and that's usually what gets missed. And
absolutely.
About just
and again, I mean, I think the dominant mode in education, sadly, is I think efficiency. It's easier to show you a picture of a microscope than to set up microscopes and have you experience them, and that's a huge difference right there. Or the middle ground today is we'll simulate that so it looks like you're using a microscope, but it's an app, But let's give them the damn microscope.
There's a lot of that I would resonate with from the writing side. So everything you said, and then to build on that, I think one of the things that you asked about sort of key conceptual pieces. So in this vision of writing, and again, whatever it is, whether you're making a video, a film, writing a dissertation, writing a poem, whatever it might be, some key things are things like iteration.
Yes.
We called it draft in the old days. You draft. This is a first draft. This is a new draft. This is my last draft. This is a doggy draft because it's rough draft. Whatever it might be, all the ways we talk about iteration. So that notion, that profound thing, that writing doesn't just spring fully formed from the head of someone who is a writer. Oh, I'm not a writer. She's a writer. And I had this vision that fully formed, it comes. When you start to see that everybody works at the craft, draft by draft, they iterate. It's like watching someone that you thought was amazing building something, but actually it took them whatever period of time to do it, and they worked through all kinds of failed prototypes on the way to it. A draft is a more or less successful prototype.
Yeah.
So one thing is iteration, I would say. The other piece is, because in writing, actually, it's one of the things I love about making and hands-on. Like, you can't usually just do that with your draft.
Yeah.
You might look at a draft and have a sense internally that it's not quite right, a felt sense that you want to keep working on it. That's an important barometer. That's an important marker. Another one, though, is sharing it with others, because you may need to get people who are not living inside your head and already know what you mean to say, reading and giving you feedback. So another one is working in an environment where you together collaborate, use peers, in a kind of virtuous circle of I will help you with yours, you will help me with mine. So the way that a peer group or network of people share and push each other toward improved performance, that's another one. How you could actually learn from the writing that's all around you is another. It's a simple thing. And just back to the very beginning about reading and writing, we teach reading in many cases, schools and out of school and elsewhere and home products, as if the only reason you would read would be to get the main idea. That's like always it. What's the theme? What's the main idea? Can you identify the main idea? Okay, that is a good thing to do. Again, Elyse is pro identifying main ideas through reading, so let that be clear. But for example, do we in fact when we write read dozens of things just to understand how someone approached the same problem? How did in fact somebody manage to move someone into a piece about a controversial issue without exacerbating a sense of adversarial beginnings or whatever the problem is I'm wrestling with a writer? All those texts that are around me and newspapers on the wall, everywhere else, they can be mentors to me. There's even this phrase, the mentor text. I think, in fact, we do that when we study how other people solve a problem in coding, when we look at other people's prototypes or making activities. So these are very old things. They're about the model, the workshop, in effect, in which we do work. So if you think we're all about people doing work, and if you think of workshop as the environment that privileges the fact of people working and producing, the design of the great workshop, whether it's a makerspace or writing center or a hacker weekend, they're principles for designing educational environments in those places. But this model that goes back centuries of the lecture, of the priest at the front reading to the congregation assembled, we're sort of doing it here. That model has come to define formal education. So the workshop is somewhat always on the side. And if we could flip that, it would be interesting to say, what if we were mostly in a workshop and occasionally, to hear from mentors or others, we gathered together in this format, but this format was the addition to an environment that was really about the work. That could just be a simple flip that would be a very powerful thing.
Yeah. Well, I wanted to say, time is, I feel like we're in the same family, because I started Make because I really like how-to information. I'm a writer, you know, and I remember that process, you know, looking back, like in high school, I had an English teacher who was not necessarily a good writer, but all he did was, whatever we wrote, he just turned it back to us and say, do it again. And I don't think he ever read them, but he just made us do it over and over again. And, you know, with great resistance, we did it. But, you know, it was where I learned to just the process of iteration and doing things. And I see this so much in the making world, that your first idea isn't your best idea. Don't fall in love with it. You know, things that you really like at the beginning, you give up because there's a different goal emerge from it. And I think there's so many similarities, and we've worked a little bit in this area of, I think it's really important that you document the work you're doing, and that you write, you describe or either the procedure you use to make something, or how, what the experience of making meant to you. So I think there's lots of ways that this sort of communication side should be really integrated, and especially I think it's really good for kids, you know, who are really good at engineering to also be pushed to communicate about what they do. And that's what we're trying to do, you know, in effect at Maker Faire, talk to people about it. And there's, you know, just as there might be a speech class, there might be a demo class. Like, how do you give a good demo or explain something? I once talked to folks at TED Ed, and they're kind of have a program to teach kids how to do like TED Talks. And I thought, well, I'd love to have a similar program where, apart from what you make, it just focuses on how do you give a good demonstration, and how do you anticipate questions, how do you deal with things that go wrong, you know. And it could be just explaining something, like the microscope, how it works or what it's used for. But it puts you in a really interesting position to use props and talk about something. And the last thing I just want to say is kind of, I think there's a great relationship here between this kind of procedural writing and even reading and code. Yeah. If you think about it, you know, making like an instructable or something is really a series of steps. You have to think about what you do first and what the next step is, and connecting those steps. It's very much how you think about code. Yeah. I'm saying like something that has 4 screws in it, it's like a loop. You've got to do the same thing 4 times, right? And there are ways that we could actually explore this language much in common. You know, how do we think about solving problems?
Well, I do think it's both true that I think all of the activities we talk about do support organizing your thinking, but sometimes people then misinterpret that to think that it's a straight line to organize it. It can be a meandering path to organize. So I think it ultimately helps you organize your thinking, but as both of you are saying, the iterative process is something that's important in all of these. Right. Or we sometimes use the word tinkering, which some people are dismissive of when they think, oh, you need to sort of plan ahead and execute. Right. Yeah. I think to all of us, tinkering captures the idea of iteration. They're trying it out, experimenting, willing to fail, but then adapting and moving forward.
Yeah, I think that sort of brings up, there's a lot of informal things that happen here that, if we're honest, I think is kind of mysterious. Yeah. You know, we don't completely understand them. And then we sort of formalize them. We say, I see it's like sometimes, I guess one of my critiques of design thinking, for instance, is we teach a formal process. I'd rather have kids get the experience of design, like this, just the sense of iteration. You did things repeatedly, and then you could talk about that formalization, rather than have them recite, you know, the 4 steps, you know, in a process. Same, you know, I see that in engineering, and so I think the things that, you know, that almost was the point of origin for me with Make was this sense of playfulness, and that's, you know, it comes out of some of the work here, that state of mind that you're in, where you're experimenting and trying. You don't care if you fail. It's it's a really, really great environment to try things out and learn from that. And I feel like that's so much richer than a lot of our models. And like you talk about, how do we create spaces in school, which I think is
or in
anywhere.
libraries or in
anywhere.
museums.
But it's almost, I think we have the opportunity to rethink space.
Yeah.
And it's towards what you were talking about also, is the group activity, where kids are learning from each other, but how much more interesting it is if they're actually doing different things in that space rather than the same thing. And they can talk about it, and they can look at it. I think it's I think one of the big differences in what tinkering used to be 50 years ago and today is, I call it the social tinkerer, rather than the lone tinker. You can do this and should do this with other people, and it makes it better. It really does.
Because the Writing Project has folks beyond just formal, we have a number of things where we have practitioners also in libraries and museums, and one of the things we do is host the U Media Learning Lab Network, which is a network of libraries and museum people who are trying to create production spaces in their institution. And actually, if you think about it, because it's very easy, since we all have a school experience to say, to contrast with schools, but thinking of libraries and then, my God, museums. If ever there were institutions created for you to consume and perhaps not even touch, in many cases, it would be especially, let's say, the Fine Arts Museum. So anywhere, and the people who participate in this, librarians, museum people, including science and tech museums, a little bit more hands-on, but then the Fine Arts Museum, which is so much about admiring the work of others, seeing why it's actually better than anything you could ever create or aspire to create, and then feeling humbled in its presence and chastised and a better person for having encountered greatness. I mean, that's the theory of the Fine Arts Museum. I speak as a humanities person, unlearning a lot of that myself. So for these institutions to create places for people to make and create inside of institutions whose centuries of history are the opposite. And in a way, we have this opportunity now, this moment, I think, around the internet, for example. We've created one of the most currently, I would say, the most powerful tool for distribution and access ever created. So everything that the library or the museum was created to do, to be able to gather and distribute, is bested by the internet. I mean, a million times. In a way, freeing these institutions a little bit from that historic mission to be playful about themselves in some cases. But we collectively, and I think Scratch is part of that, we collectively hold the moment to say, will we use that tool or the digital tools that interact in different ways with it? Will those tools become distribution tools, or will those tools be things that we actually turn over, put in the hands of everyone to create new value for themselves, free of the commercial value for myself? Is that what we will teach everyone to do with the internet and with digital tools?
I think that's a great point to end on, because I really do think that that's what we're all about.
And the time is up. Both are true.
But I think that really does capture that, all of us are really looking to see how we can sort of, put more power in the hands of people to be creating, develop new identities as people who can be full participants.
Right. Not just to find a few, but to really think about the many.
Yeah, right. To really reach everybody, to be able to have everybody being able to be designing, creating, be full and active participants. Right. And as Elyse was saying, I think there is a moment right now that there's a greater openness. The fact that the maker movement gets invited to the White House. It's a moment that there's an opportunity to take some of these ideas of learning through, passion, play, along with peers and working on projects. There's a moment where there's greater openness to it, but that moment could also slip away, and it makes it all the more important for us to reach across and make connections with other communities that share those similar values. That, again, for us, it's not just about coding individually. That's not going to succeed, but trying to reach across and to work together and learn with other communities that share those values to try to help take advantage of that moment.
Could I mention educator?
Sure.
Okay, so educatorinnovator.org Very easy to remember, educatorinnovator.org. It is a place where a variety of folks who are interested in the same general movement, but from across different places, come together to provide learning opportunities for practitioners. Scratch Ed is part of that, Maker Ed is part of that, NWP is part of that, and a whole range of other folks. Webinars, discussions, and then increasingly mini-grant opportunities for people to work as practitioners about creating different conditions for young people to learn. So check it out.
Great.
Educatorinnovator, as one word, .org.
Okay. Educatorinnovator.org.
And with that, we'll turn that off.
Okay.
Before the batteries go.
Yeah.
I mean, as we wrap up, before we go to the break, one final announcement is that some of you went to the workshop yesterday where the Scratch Ed team with Karen and Michelle and others, Kristen and others, unveiled their new creative computing curriculum guide. And people who were there was a great response to it. People were really excited. And people who weren't there were also very disappointed not to be able to get those guides. But we're very fortunate that Karen and the rest of the Scratch Ed team have been able to bring over and provide the newly printed, these are hot off the press just yesterday, the new creative computing curriculum guide. So for any of you who are interested, please feel free to come up afterwards. Karen, Michelle, Kristen, others will be here to give you a guide. Again, the numbers are still limited. Please limit yourself to one, but we're happy that they're happy to distribute to everyone who's here and are looking forward to also engaging in kind of conversation, hearing about your experiences with it, and really hope that you'll try things out and then share your experiences on Scratch Ed. So thanks a lot. We're off to break now and then parallel sessions, and enjoy the rest of the day.